Now, the Swedenborg's vast system of psychic cosmology, we have a framework within which to establish a psychological view, a material view, and a spiritual view of reality. Many people who read Swedenborg don't appreciate the many dimensions that he covers in his huge presentation of what the real universe is like. And it's very important for the thinking person, the person who wants to understand, who wants to know, to pursue Swedenborg into all these dimensions and directions that he has pursued and studied in direct perception, and try to build a similar sort of framework within themselves. We cannot afford to bring small-scale thinking into these deep and ponderous studies. I find that a lot of people read Swedenborg, but they read him literally. And yet all through his writings he's talking about thinking correspondentially. He writes correspondentially. You've got to go beyond the written word. It's one thing to go beyond the written word of God itself. But you must go beyond the written word of Swedenborg. If you take Swedenborg literally, you're sunk. You're sunk as though you're a literalist in spiritual writings. So we must see Swedenborg as opening a whole series of doors to a vaster universe. We belong to something immense, something great. One has to feel this, one has to know it, one has to intuit that it's there and explore it. Otherwise, if we just stick nice theories in our minds and sit in our armchairs with pious contentment, then we've become less than fly droppings. Think about that. Now, within this vast framework, Swedenborg makes it very, very clear that the universe is a highly ordered structure. The divine essence has so created things that there are high levels, intermediate levels, and lower levels. And both of you know from the readings that you've done with Swedenborg, from studies you've carried out, that his presentation is something like this. At the foundation is the Lord God. But the divine is not some ethereal, evaporating, gaseous substance. It is a real, tangible substance in its own right, at its own level. And from that they come by divine will, by divine wisdom, by divine conspiring or visualizing interactivity, a whole series of progressive condensations, crystallizations, so that you have world upon world being built. First there is the ultrafine celestial, then that gives rise to the somewhat denser, less mobile spiritual, and that in turn leads to the ultimate, which is the natural physical world in which we exist. And so we have, in effect, a descending scale. Of what we can call vibratory rate and increasing inertia. The lower we come down the scale, the more inert substances become, the less autonomy they have. They have a lower frequency of vibration. Now, it's within this framework that the whole drama of cosmic life is enacted. Swedenborg stresses that the whole system is imbued with life, that there's this divine essence that penetrates and supports and sustains all things. But it's not only Swedenborg who perceived this. Throughout the ages there have been visionaries and seers who also, in elevated states of consciousness, noticed this divine presence in and through all things. Just listen to this quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the great Indian classics. With a share of myself, I pervade and support this entire universe. Now that's a marvelous statement, and Swedenborg is saying the same things, perhaps a little less poetically. But the same process is are very difficult for us to understand, the divine extends its fundamental presence, its fundamental wisdoms and energies and affections through the whole lot. And Swedenborg stresses the universe can only hang together because these lawful, orderly, conscious processes are deliberately placed there to make the universe what it is. The universe is not a self-organizing structure. Inert matter cannot, in a jangling manner of colliding atoms, assemble itself into beings like us. That's low-grade scientific assumption. The reality is, when we use our inner perceptions, when we use the enlightened inner perceptions of people throughout the ages, that the universe is this. It is a living, orderly system. Life becomes less universal, it becomes less vibrant, less conscious as we come down the scale. So in the natural world, we are living in a series of end effects. But what is the relationship between us and this creative source? What is it that causes us to live? Life is the active essence of divine being. And that one being, it cannot divide itself into little chunks or particles. It is quite impossible for God to break himself up into tiny little gods. That doesn't happen. Because the divine is infinite. The infinite cannot partition itself. It's because of the wholeness of its infinity, it is what it is. Now that's not meant to be a play on words. We're trying to describe the indescribable. Life consists in the totality, the wholeness of those potencies and powers and affections and wisdoms and consciousness and potentials that are there. It's that totality that is the oneness of life, and that life cannot be broken. Hence, in that quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, with a share of myself, the Sanskrit word is ansha, which means I share. I don't divide, I don't break up into chunks, I share. Now let's try to use another diagram to illustrate how this sharing can possibly take place. Now we have to use our mental visualization because it is impossible with any sort of diagram to describe reality. We're only trying to get the mind to look in a certain direction, to get a certain feel about this. So we mustn't pretend that these diagrams explain reality. They don't. They're only like signposts to point the direction in which to go. But we shall say that this is the infinite ocean of divine life. It's indivisible. It cannot be broken up into parts. How then do individual organisms which have life in them arise? Well, it's something like this. Between the divine itself and the whole orderly system of creation, there is a kind of an interface, something like the surface of the sea. Now imagine that each point along this interface we have little waves being generated. Some are larger than others, some are quite small, some may be even trivial. But imagine a series of waves, and this one unbroken, living, vibrating, flowing divine energy pours itself into these wave-like structures. That means that this energy does not divide itself, but it shares itself. Now let us give a name to each one of these. Let us say that this is a plant, that this is an ape, that this is a diatom, this may be a bacteria, this may be a man, and this may be a tree. This is just a way of trying to illustrate how we have the appearance of individualized lives as seen from the outside, whereas in truth they are not divided lives, they are individual manifestations of this one reality which finds its creative tendencies, its delight, its expressiveness in generating a very great abundance of forms through which its own immense, inexhaustible potentials are brought into powerful manifestation through each one of these forms and the various functions associated with these forms. It is the one life which shares itself but is not divided into tiny little lifelets. Now this is an important thing. It has practical implications for us. We may feel that we are separate little life units. We are not. We are shares of this one unbroken life. Although we often feel weak and insignificant, if we can raise our consciousness inwardly just a little, we shall begin to realize that we belong to an immense order. We belong to an infinite order of existence. Not that we can expect infinite power to suddenly rush through us and we become like Mandrake the magician. Far from it. But to realize that although on the outside we are relatively weak, nevertheless something is flowing in all the time to sustain us, to energize us, and we belong to something that can never be run down, something that can never be exhausted, something that can never be depleted. And it is this flow, this constant flow of life into us, that's what Swedenborg refers to as influx. Influx is a very real, ongoing, dynamic process. And there are times when we get into an appropriate state of emotional sensitivity, calmness, quietness, and we learn to discipline ourselves. It requires a lot of work to do this. We can sometimes feel the influx as an ongoing process. Swedenborg says, and it was true in his day, that very few people felt it, but some people did feel it. That's the important thing. Today, because many people are looking towards a spiritual process of transforming their lives, they practice yoga, they practice tantra, they practice soothing methods, they practice all sorts of things, and they become a little more sensitized. More people today can learn to feel this influx. It's part of our being duty to ourselves to do so. Now, we have this idea of a dynamic universe. That means that the universe is filled with action. God is not inactive. God doesn't sit back on a great throne, occasionally combing his beard and just seeing how vast creation is. It's not like that. God never goes on strike. If God did so, the whole universe would instantly collapse because it is the divine action that supports, energizes, and sustains all things. It animates living things, and it activates inorganic things like electrons and atoms to be active and vibrant. Indeed, it is action which shows up throughout all levels of the universe. Action is one of the key words. Now, for physicists, action is a very important process. There are various mathematical definitions of it. We talk about the law of least action, and so on. But physically, action is defined as action is the time interval of energy. Never mind about the equation if you don't understand calculus. It's only an expression, but energy combined with time creates action. Action is the way that things work. We act. Every time we act, we use energy over its time interval. But the universe is in a state of action. It cannot help but be in a state of action because this is the divine conatus, the divine striving to generate movement, to translate possibilities into actualities, to realize, to fulfill all these visual possibilities that are conceived and contrived to actualize and manifest. And it's this action which we see at work even in things like stars and planets. For example, suppose we have a reigning sun there. Such is the action of the sun. It acts upon surrounding space-time and causes it to curve. And it's that curvature of space-time that is the gravitational field. And the gravitational fields, they help to hold the universe together. You see, action is occurring at all levels. Now, once we catch an image of a dynamic, vibrant, moving universe, then we can relate ourselves to all this ongoing process. And what is important about this universe of action is that it's not a chaotic, disorderly state of affairs. In the final analysis, it is orderly. And in that order, there is the effort to produce and manifest uses. Swedenborg is very strong on the doctrine of uses. He states that everything that comes into existence is for the sake of carrying out functions that are serviceable. Everything helps everything else in this universe, if we look far enough. Everything feeds upon everything else. That's the law of reciprocal feeding, well known to the ancients, forgotten by modern man. Everything in a way is supporting everything else. But the Darwinists and so on, they say that everything's struggling against everything else. Nature ready to tooth and claw. That's true up to a point, but it's not the whole truth. Mutual cooperation between organisms, and we'll give you some examples a little later on, show that there is a cooperative functional usefulness at work in this cosmos. Now, uses are the way in which divine love and divine wisdom come into manifestation. So there we have the divine triad. It's not three persons. It's the threefold action of one creative time source reality. It manifests as love, it manifests as wisdom, it manifests as functional uses. Everything has its proper place, its proper activities to carry out. And the challenge is, for each one of us, what is my use? What is my functionality in this world? What am I capable of? And we have to keep challenging ourselves with this. No good saying, well, I'm a mathematician, I'm a research scientist, I'm a writer, I'm a composer. That is not enough. That's just a career we're following. It may be a partial fulfillment of our uses, but there is so much more that we are assimilated in. Now, Swedenborg tells us that uses are so important because uses shape the forms that we see in the visible world. Behind these flowing energies, we have spiritual uses or tendencies to manifest in the world in particular ways. And it's the uses that he says generates the form of the organism. An earthworm is long and slender. It has a hydraulic skeleton within itself. It has little bristles to the side of its body. It has mucus around its body. So that it can burrow through soft soil and create tunnels. And the way in which its circular and longitudinal muscles and the hydrostatic skeleton work together is just right for that shape. No other creature can do quite what an earthworm does. And earthworms turn the soil out. They help the soil to become fertile. And without their action, our soil will be in a very, very poor state on the face of this earth. But the shape of the organism is expressive of the function it carries out in tunneling and helping oxygen to circulate through the soil and taking the organic matter into the soil. So I must say that uses help to generate the forms that are there. Swedenborg says this: it is use that commands the forms. This shows that the use existed before the organic forms of the body came forth. tremendous concept. It's not just a nice, neat little explanation. We say, oh, yeah, I agree with that. It is something which should start a whole congeries of mental associations, mental researchers, reading, study, observation, so we can verify these principles for ourselves. Swedenborg was stating cosmic principles. Our job is to verify these principles. He was a great verifier, a great observer. Even in his private garden, when he planted seeds, he'd wait till they germinated, and then when they flowered, he would collect the seeds from the plants and count the seeds and relate it to the general fertility of the plant. He was interested in everything. This isn't the only way to live. We've got to be interested in everything that's taking place. Otherwise, how can we relate to creation? How can we bring our dormant potentials into manifestation if we don't do something about it? Action. Action is necessary. Spiritual action, psychological action, biological action. We have to be like the things that are around us. They are in active manifestation, and so must we be to become a full being. Now, when we look closely at living things, we find that amongst their many properties, there are two features that are outstanding. And thanks to the findings of modern science, and modern science has given us a tremendous number of insights and benefits, there are two things that stand out. And the first is that living things have a fine structure. And by means of the optical microscope, the electron microscope, and some of the new tunneling ion microscopes and field ion microscopes and so on, incredible insights are being gained into the fine structure of things. Just to give a simple example, under the optical microscope, years ago, we stained cells with a certain type of dye in an animal cell. We could see the nucleus with its chromosomes and these little thread-like structures, the mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, but nothing much was known about. My university used to say, oh, they carry digestive enzymes. That's all that was known. That was a guess. It was completely wrong. But with the electron microscope, you can blow a mitochondrion up, and you can show that it has a magnificent structure with folded membranes, and you've even got a strand of DNA molecule inside there. And you've got spaces between the membranes, and that's for a purpose. When certain substances enter the mitochondrion, protons, that is, hydrogen ions, are pumped into the outer membrane, or in between those two membranes, and they're stored there for a little while. And then when the synthesis of a substance called ATP takes place, these protons are pumped back in, causing ADP, adenosine diphosphate, which is combined with inorganic phosphate, and these merge together, and so a chemical synthesis takes place. The shape, the marvelous shape of the mitochondrion enables the function to be performed. The function, according to Swedenborg, precedes the form. The need to make adenosine triphosphate was foreseen as something necessary for the healthy function of the organism. That was the potential use, and so a form had to be generated so that use could be carried out. But this is only an illustration of the fine structure of things. With molecular biology, with biochemical tracing out of pathways of metabolism and transformation, incredibly fine details are now being revealed, which further illustrates Swedenborg's principle that no matter how much you divide some whole object, you'll come to finer and finer and finer parts, almost without limit. Infinite divisibility into finer and finer features. And this is certainly being shown by modern research. Now that's the first principle. We've already looked at it in an abbreviated way. The second principle concerns energy. any organism, we find that all organisms, without exception, they assimilate energy from a variety of sources, usually in the form of food, although plants get their basic energy from solar radiation. Organisms store energy. Organisms transform energy into, shall we say, heat energy or chemical energy, metabolic energy or whatever, and also they extend energy. So all living things are devices, cosmic devices, and note the term, they're cosmic devices for turning energy over, for changing it from one form or manifestation into another. Now suppose you have the laziest man on the earth who does nothing. He's too lazy to even draw the doll. Now how's that? Even the laziest person on earth, by the very fact of his existence, is turning energy over. He is fulfilling these cosmic processes. So even though he does nothing from himself, he's still doing a little bit of good in the universe. In the East, they call such people little bits of cosmic manure. They have their uses, even though they don't voluntarily contribute anything to the ongoing pattern of reality. But when we realize that we have a fine structure in us, a very, very detailed fine structure that goes from coarse substances and gradually to finer and finer substances, we see there must be a progression towards the spiritual, eventually towards the celestial, and ultimately towards the divine. It is a gradation. Every level is different from the preceding and the succeeding level. Each level carries out functions and operations in its own right, but they are linked together in a meaningful way. That's what characterizes this universe. It is from the divine source that meaning comes forth. Life means everything to the divine, and what it generates is full of meaning. Down at this level, we see all sorts of events and phenomena taking place. We can't figure them out. We say, well, they don't have any meaning. And far too many second-rate scientific brains, in learning things like evolution and chance expectation in a purely rote fashion, they're only quoting their theorems, only quoting their lectures when they say there is no purpose, there is no meaning in life. That's an affront to human intelligence. We know that we can generate meaning and values and qualities in our lives. Even animals act at times as though there is a purpose. The beetle which builds its dams and then builds its community of logs and so on within that dam is building with a purpose. The bee that lays up honey to tide it through the winter months, there is a purpose in its activities. As we study these biological phenomena, there are millions of them, we begin to see that there is a meaningfulness that runs through the framework of things. And because life is an indivisible oneness, that meaning must come from a higher source and manifest itself in a variety of ways according to the level and degree of our understanding. So these are important principles for us to consider. We have to build our thinking, our living, and our aspiring on the basis of these foundations. Now, when we get the idea that there is a creative, intelligent, orderly wisdom that runs through the universe, then we're going to be able to build for ourselves a new understanding of the nature and meaning of our life. But when we say, oh, there's no meaning to things, we run into difficulties, as many of the physicists have done so. The Big Bang Theory was a great adventure in intellectual interpretation of how the stars and galaxies got into their position. But there's a huge deficit in the theory, because the theory cannot tell you where the laws of nature come from. And this worries the scientists. It's one thing to say, well, the atoms, the electrons, the muons, pions, and so on came from this ultra-hot plasma within 10 to the minus 30th of a second of the Big Bang. But they can't explain where the laws of nature come from. Because the laws of nature are manifestations of meaning. That's the orderly, meaningful way in which the universe operates. They can't say where it comes from. Well, if the system cannot explain where the laws come from, the system is a failure. It's a brave attempt. And we have to make brave attempts. All the great theories of science are adventures in trying to understand reality. Sure, mistakes are going to be made, but we're only finite beings. We can correct our mistakes. We can build on the basis of new knowledge, new insights. But we've got to have a broad approach. We can't say, well, let's go through this tunnel. Let's try this particular snake hole to see if this gives the answer to immortality and so on. We've got to see the whole spectrum of reality. We have to have a reach towards the heavens. We have to be able to reach into the finest details of the material world in which we exist. Unless we have a full octave of span, we can't sound the harmonies of the music of life within our soul. Now, the fact that in spiritual thought, that all meaning, absolute meaning, is in the divine, and in each level of reality, lesser and lesser meanings become manifest. From this principle alone, we should be able to reason to ourselves. All right, if something comes into manifestation here, organisms or processes, then, in addition to being objects that transform energy and that have fine structures, these things must be the manifestation of some sort of meaning, purpose, or of use. Because those terms run together very closely. When we study things in isolation, it's sometimes very hard to figure out the use of it. You can say to yourself, what's the use of a flea that's just been biting the back of my neck? Or a mosquito which bites me and gives me malaria or dengue fever. We don't see it as a useful creature, but somewhere in the economy of nature, it is fulfilling a life cycle of some sort. Now let's have a look at some examples from nature in which we deal with pairs of things that interrelate to each other. A thing taken in isolation is very hard to understand, but when we see it in functional relationship with something else, we begin to catch a meaning. Now what we're trying to show here is that behind many of the phenomena of nature there are meaningful, purposeful processes. Now these are only random samples. Out of the tens of thousands that we could choose, we could perhaps find much better ones than the ones that I'm using. But first of all, let us consider the oil beetles. Now these organisms are found in parts of Europe and the United States of America. Now they are flightless beetles. They can't fly, even though they've got these little wing cases and so on. They can't fly. So the female, she lays eggs in little cracks in the soil. So here we have the soil. The eggs are laid there, and when they hatch, a large number of little larvae come out. The larvae then crawl onto the stems of nearby plants, make their way up, and they settle on the flowers. So you've got all these little larvae settling on the flowers, which of course are visited by a variety of insects. But the oil beetle larva must attach itself to just one single species of solitary bee. Now in different countries it's a different species of solitary bee, but it's always just one species. So all the organisms that visit the flower, there's only one species of solitary bee that will do. So along comes the bee. We'll just use a very, very rough diagram. These larvae, they attach themselves to the legs of the bee, and it flies off to its nest. There, the larvae drop off, and the larvae will soon find their way into the cells, little bits of honeycomb, where there is an egg the bee has recently laid, and there'll be some nectar or maybe some honey there and some pollen grains. And each larva will enter one of these, will eat the egg, and so you've got a developing larva instead of an egg now, and it starts to feed on the honey and on the pollen. Now what was interesting, these larvae undergo several molts whilst they're in the nest. And in their later molts, they develop a form in which the spiracles, the little inlets into their breathing tubes, are on the upper surface, so as these things can float on the surface of the sticky liquid and not drown. That in itself is a remarkable arrangement. Accidental. The idea of accidental formations of things is a joke. Corresponds to certain types of politicians trying to be serious. Now eventually that larva will hatch into a fully formed beetle, an oil beetle. It will crawl out of the bee's nest, make its way across the soil to a plant. It will mate with another beetle. The eggs are laid and the whole life cycle is repeated. Now notice this. We have the larva of the oil beetle and we have a solitary bee. They must work together so that the life of the solitary bee, or life of the oil beetle, can continue. The larva doesn't have the brains, it doesn't have the intelligence within itself to say, a solitary bee, it's just the right sort of aerial bus. I've got to catch this bus in order to survive. The larva doesn't have that capacity. Nor does a bee say to itself, oh, poor little larva, it needs nourishing, it hasn't got a mother now, I'll take a tail out and feed it upon the food intended for my young. You don't have this individual working out of interrelationship. That relationship is worked out by something which stands behind the organisms. This is where meaning, this is where purpose and where use comes into play. The suggestion is there is an integrating spiritual principle which takes unlike organisms and brings them together in a unified functional form for the continuation of their existence. Now that's only one example. There is a species of orchid called Ophrys. Now the Ophrys orchid is pollinated by a certain kind of bee. I think the species of bee is Dialis, but I'm a little bit hazy on that. Now, the orchid is shaped in such a way that the lip of the orchid, and here we're just doing a very, very crude drawing, the lip of the orchid is arranged in such a way that it gives the appearance, I've done it a little bit too wide there, gives the appearance of being a bee, and it's got the same markings as a female bee. Now that's the lip of the orchid. And seen from above, you look at it and think, hey, that looks a bit like a bee. Now, a male bee comes along, and he's thoroughly taken in. Wow, female, you see, so he settles down in the right position and attempts to copulate with this bee, which is only a flower. Not even a pansy, it's a flower. So, in sending its abdomen down to the throat of the flower, it picks up these pollen sacs on its abdomen, unwittingly. Being as it were, it flies away after going half a mile, so it comes across another flower. Being stupid, it's taken in again. And it repeats the act. But it transfers the pollen to the stigmas of the next organ, so cross-pollination is effective. Now, can we honestly say to ourselves, the intelligent, clever flower sees the bee, and it says to itself, I'm going to imitate one of these, I'm going to make myself look like a female bee. That doesn't happen. There is no nervous system. There is none of that sort of sensitivity in plants between the bee and the flower, there is an integrating principle which sees both of them in operation and makes mutual use of both. This is an organizing principle. Female bees never visit these flowers, only the males. They're taken in because it looks remarkably like a female. In Australia, we have certain types of orchids. Just forgot the name, must look up the name here. It's cryptostaris. We have cryptostaris orchids. And these are pollinated by lysopestile wasps. Now, the same sort of thing happens. Many of these orchids have flowers which resemble, in three ways, a female bee. They resemble the form of the bee at times, they greatly resemble the covering of the female wasp, and they also give off aromas which are just like those of the female wasp. And the male wasp is tricked into attempting to copulate with the flowers and transmits the pollen just as the bee did. So you see, we're not looking at just a one-off incident with the Ophrys orchid. We're looking at something which is widespread. There are dozens and dozens of examples of this, of flowers that are built to resemble the female of an insect species, and the male insect is taken in. But it helps the pollination and the spread and the multiplication and fructification of these plants. And the bee profits because in due course it collects a little bit of the pollen for its own food, and it gradually gets honey out of these flowers. So both are at a great advantage. Now consider this. Rainforests, especially in South America, are sometimes devastated in parts by earthquakes, volcanic upheavals, or very violent storms. So if they have a great forest, there may be a large area, maybe several acres, which are severely damaged by a natural disaster. Now the troublesome thing is here that the root mat, which is so important for the survival of these rainforests, the root mat becomes exposed to damaging solar radiation. And unless something is done within a relatively short period of time, that part of the forest may not be able to regenerate itself into its original form. And so an amazing thing happens here. Scattered through this soil, and it's usually about between 11 and 50 seeds per square metre, there are the seeds of the plant known as cecropia. There are several species of this cecropia. Now, once sunlight reaches it directly, these seeds germinate and they grow very quickly. More than 2 metres a year. So here they are, about this high, in less than a year, and they've got quite a good spread of leaves. Now, as these cecropias grow, so all sorts of vines in the tropical forest, they begin to creep up on these growing stems. They tend to bend them over and damage them and interfere with the growth of these things. But something steps in to stop these creepers and climbers from ruining the growth of these protective trees. Because these trees, they produce a leafy canopy. They rather rapidly shelter the root mat from the sun's radiations. Now that's the important thing about preserving that root mat, or that organic mass that is so important for the cycling of nutrients in the tropical soil, which is not well fertilized. If the root mat can be preserved, and these cecropia trees, as they grow, even if they're very small, they provide a good cover. They stop the sun's radiations getting in. But if you have these creepers which are getting up on the plant, and they're beginning to bend the plants over and damage them, all the good that these young cecropia trees are doing is ruined. But here is an astonishing thing. These cecropia trees, they have hollows in them. And in those hollow spaces, there are these, as Teca ants about 40 species of these ants, but these particular ones, especially in South American forests, they are extraordinary. Because when they detect creepers making their way around the stems, out they come and they'll nip these creepers and they'll actually cast them off the plant. They prune them. They prune the creepers. They don't prune the scraping tree, they prune the creepers. And if little epiphytic plants such as mosses and ferns begin to grow there, they'll loosen up their roots and toss them overboard. These are real gardens. But they do an extraordinarily good job. That enables these cecropia trees to grow to become fully decayed. Now these trees only live about 30 to 50 years. After a while, some of them die. And as they die, so you have little light spaces being produced. And it's through those light spaces that the genuine rainforest trees emerge and gradually establish themselves again. But that couldn't happen unless these tetrax help these cecropia trees to function together. Now, that's not all. In return, the cecropia trees, on their leaves, they have nectaries. And in those nectaries, they produce nectar, which the ants feed upon. And in the axons of these leaves, there are these Mullerian bodies that are packed with proteins, which only the ants take and digest. They help each other. Now again, we can't say the ants get together and say, listen boys, throw up the creepers and the tree will repay us with food and nectar. And the tree doesn't say, dear little ants, come along, I've got a hollow body live within me, and if you keep me free of all these worries and troubles, you've got plenty of food. No, it is something greater than the plant, something greater than the ant, which is the organizer. Now this goes on and on and on. We'll just give one more example. We could quote thousands. We could spend a week just on these examples. There is something extraordinary taking place in this world that we must see what is happening. If we take Tridacna, now we find that that's the big clamshell that grows in the barrier. Now underwater, when the Tridacna clam opens its shell up, it exposes this wonderful coloured mantle. It's a mass of flesh and it's brightly coloured. Now the colouring is due to tiny little organisms called zooxanthellae. Now these zooxanthellae are very, very small, they're microscopic, but they carry chlorophyll and pigments as well. It's the pigments that give this lovely colouring to the mantle of the plant. So they've got chlorophyll in. Now these things live by the hundreds of thousands or even the millions in the tissues of the clam's body. When its shell is open, it's exposed to sunlight because these grow in shallow water. Now these zooxanthellae, they produce sugars and proteins, amino acids and other things, and it's the clam that feeds on those. It has been found that some of these giant clams, they don't have to even eat anything. They are totally supported by the metabolic activities of the zooxanthellae. The zooxanthellae, in turn, here they've got a nice permanent home. They're sheltered. Little creatures on the outside, like planktonic organisms, don't come and gobble them up. They're secure within the tissues, as supplied with carbon dioxide there from the respiration of the clam, and in turn they feed the clam. This is a togetherness. And every time we have a togetherness of things, the clam and these quite different creatures, something sees that they need to be together to create a persistent biological function. Now the same holds true for corals. Corals are little sea anemone-like polyps, and they secrete on the outside of themselves the calcareous skeleton. In their soft tissues, the same zooxanthellae are present, and that's what gives the living coral its different colours. Corals can only survive when they are infested with zooxanthellae. If the coral becomes sick for some reason, if a little silt settles on the coral, or the water changes, the pH of the water changes too much, the zooxanthellae, they skew it off. They all leave the sinking ship, as it were, and sometimes the coral dies. If for some reason coral health improves, the zooxanthellae return and say that the coral was able to prosper. Now, all of these are just examples, just a few examples out of thousands of how things working together, things that, unlike biological origins and properties, work together in a functional way to make something proceed. And in the case of corals, they are massive builders. They alter the geography of a country. These are not insignificant little biological curiosities. These are large-scale activities in many instances. The regeneration of forests, that's a big activity. All of these are the meaningful outworkings of a higher organizing principle of work which foresees, which generates a use, and uses 3, 4, a dozen organisms in a life cycle if necessary to make something function. Now that's the spiritual dimension of biology. Something of an unseen nature as far as our senses is concerned is working towards the functional smoothness and togetherness of the visible end effects that we see in the world around us. Now we find that Swedenborg likes to talk about correspondences. For him, correspondence is one of the functional ways in which the universe has been built. Because in that scale that we organized initially, celestial, spiritual, natural levels, he declares that the higher things, that is, divine things correspond to celestial, celestial corresponds to spiritual, spiritual corresponds to natural things. Correspondences link things together in a meaningful way. What is it we correspond to? We have a highly complex biology and anatomy. What do we correspond to? We have to ponder this. But the correspondences are very important because quoting Swedenborg once again, he says, nature has been created simply for clothing the spiritual and presenting it in a corresponding form in the ultimate of order. Now, on this basis, since everything corresponds to something that brought it forth into existence and manifestation, that correspondence is the process of linking the higher or the inner with the outer manifestation. Behind every form, there is a set of uses, functions, potencies, and meanings. It means just that everything that we see in the universe is a sort of a cosmic hieroglyph of unseen things. We must learn to read the hieroglyphs of nature. Everything has a significance. We have a significance. But self-knowledge, self-understanding, a lot of hard work on our part is necessary to bring out this significance and meaning. What is the aim, sense, meaning of our life? That's the great search. That's always been the great search with thinking people throughout the ages. Today, certainly people say, oh, we were taught in biology at school that it's all fortuitous and accidental arising, and there's no purpose. We're just here by accident. So live, eat, drink, be merry, live fully, because tomorrow we die. You know, the philosophy of the grey ages. Well, we're not like that. We have long-term aims. We sense intuitively that within ourselves there are depths, there are values, there are qualities worth struggling for, which we must unfold. Through consciousness, we need an inside view of reality. Amongst the many seers and visionaries and mystics throughout the ages, like Plotinus of ancient Alexandria, like Ibn al-Arabi, the Sufi, Jalal Rumi, Milarepa, Jakob Böhme, Swedenborg, people like this, they had different degrees of internal perception. Of all of them, Swedenborg had the greatest and the clearest perception. Something absolutely extraordinary was given to him. But he had the inside view of reality. He said that other people, if they just abstract themselves from identification with external thinking, they too can have the same sort of perception. And this is certainly possible. The experts tell us that when we're in a serious, down-to-earth, external state, then we see reality clearly. But if we're in a state of internal spiritual optimism, that's hooey. What a piece of bunk, what a piece of hypocrisy. Who the heck are these people to say that when you're serious and life is deadly and non-living, then that's real, and all else is false expectation? To heck with them. We could say other things too, we're not going to. The final word we must say on rebirth. Rebirth is one of the reasons why we exist. To be transformed from an external, biological, mind and sense-based being into a spiritual being with cosmic responsibilities, with the feeling that we have an obligation to the creating forces that brought us forth. That rebirth or transformation is crucial. And nature is filled with examples. Very briefly, we've got things like this. We have a case of a tadpole and the frog. And the frog is utterly different from the tadpole. It's undergone a metamorphosis, a transformation, to become a different looking organism altogether. It feeds on quite different stuff. Certainly it can swim in the water that it exists, especially the tadpole for a long time in the dry land. A caterpillar, it can only crawl over leaves and twigs. But it transforms itself into the chrysalis, from which emerges a beautiful flying butterfly. The caterpillar is often a fleshy, unpleasant-looking thing. But this is elegant, it is delicate, it has an incredibly wondrous anatomy with flight muscles, and it's free to move about. It's not confined to crawling over twigs. The story was told there were two caterpillars crawling over leaves and talking to one another, and all of a sudden a butterfly flew overhead. And one caterpillar said to the other, "You'll never catch me up there in one of those things." Even though it's destined to become one. But you see, the transformation is immense. Now, this transformation or change of form, that's the all-important thing. Nature is filled with hundreds of thousands of examples of change of form. The lesson is there. The divine creates an imagery. It creates a symbolism. It creates these correspondences. We must read them. The world is filled with examples in an outward way of what we must do in an inward way. If we can learn to undergo this change of form and open up our spiritual resources, and with the same objectivity that we look at a scientific experiment, we look at the root energies and basic laws and principles that cause our mind and spirit to function, we shall become a complete being. We shall span the whole diapason of life's experiences. The inward perception of a greater reality, the outward perception of the fruits of that reality and manifestation. That's why we exist on the planet. We have that double reach. And this is explained very carefully by Swedenborg, who talks about people undergoing and who have undergone regeneration in these final words. A man who is being regenerated, and also a man who is regenerated, passes through variations of states of love and faith, by elevation towards interior things and by depression towards exterior things. And it means this: a person has his ups and his downs, and we mustn't be disorganized because things seem to go wrong at times. People say after they've been working on themselves, "Oh, look, life's getting queer, things are going wrong." It's this oscillation of up and down. That's an oscillation between the spiritual pole and the natural pole. That's the only way we're going to have this full spread of the reality to which we're exposed. The other is the spiritual dimension. The lower is our biological dimension. We have to be better. Thank you.